Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. Yesterday's mass protests by farmers against the government's inheritance tax plans is one of the big stories of the weekend.
If I died tomorrow and the proposed legislation was enforced tomorrow, I would have to pay the inland revenue around £1 million.
When I'm dead and gone, it's my children or nothing. There's going to be no farm there from the farm.
Fears about the future of farming have increased since the news emerged 3 months ago, so is the government listening? We'll hear from the Ulster Farmers Union shortly. Plus, with climate change firmly in the international headlines, with the Californian fires and President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, how are we doing here on reducing emissions and increasing renewable energy use? I'll hear from the man appointed to be a critical friend to the Stormont administration on what he says needs to be done and what's holding things up. And keeping a keen eye over both issues as always, our agriculture and environment correspondent Louise Cullen. No sooner have the devastating winds of Éowyn died down than another political storm is brewing. Farmers the length and breadth of the UK protested yesterday at proposed inheritance tax changes, which they say will devastate generations of family farming and change entirely the wider industry. In a moment, I'll be speaking to the president of the Ulster Farmers Union. But first, here's Lindsay Telford.
It looked like a show of strength. A united front opposing what they see as a brutal tax. But under it, fear for their farms and future generations.
Northern Ireland is predominantly family-run family farms, and we're fourth generation. My daughter Annabelle would hopefully want to farm someday, and I would not like to put that tax burden on her.
If I died tomorrow and the proposed legislation was enforced tomorrow, I would have to pay the inland revenue around £1 million.
When I'm dead and gone, it's my children or nothing. There's going to be no farm there from the farm.
The change to inheritance tax was announced in the budget late last year and involves a cap on what's known as agricultural property relief. It means that farms worth more than £1 million could be liable for inheritance tax at 20%. According to the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, almost half of farms in Northern Ireland could be affected.
In Londonderry, anger.
My daughter would find that she'd have to sell probably 60, 80 acres to cover the tax, and that makes the farm unviable. It's a vicious, cruel tax, and it has to go.
And in Fermanagh, this message.
It's not a quick pound making exercise. They're actually going to lose more than what they're going to gain. It's literally going to put a lot of us out of business.
I would have to sell a portion of my ground to pay the bill, which is not right.
The rallies were part of a UK-wide day of action, calling for Westminster to scrap its plans. They made a lot of noise, but was the government listening?
Lindsay Telford reporting. Well, I'm joined now by the UFU President, William Irvine. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us today. Anyone out and about yesterday where those tractor rallies were happening will have been aware of them. But what did those protests achieve, do you think?
In themselves, probably not too much. But the significant point about the protests was they were happening right across the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. So we were doing this in unison with our English, Scottish and Welsh counterparts. The aim of the rallies was we had a lot of traction on this issue on the run-up to Christmas. We wanted to put it back on the media and the political agenda in the new year, and that was the aim of these rallies. OK, so if you got it back on the agenda, that's fine, and people are talking about it, and it's been covered in our newspapers, on the radio, on the television. The question is it going to make any impact whatsoever on a government which has been lobbied for several months already and says it's not changing its mind? They give all appearance of digging in. Our approach to the issue is to keep steady pressure on, and as each week goes by, there is building evidence from all around the piece supporting our position rather than the government's position. Every report that comes out and every new analysis tends to be support our position on this.
But you know that the government has said that it thinks there are mitigations in place that mean the change, when it happens, won't have the impact that farmers say it will have. When the Secretary of State was asked about this last October, he said the majority of farms would be unaffected by the decision to change inheritance tax relief for farmers. He was adamant.
The government was adamant across the board. They got it wrong. Our own Department of Agriculture, DAERA, when they got time to consider it and use the information they had to draw up their report, their take is it will impact significantly 50% of the farms. There's an organisation, the Central Association of Auctioneers and Valuers. They have done a piece of work. They reckon over a generation this will have severe implications for 75,000 farms across the United Kingdom. That reinforces what we have said from the outset here. Not only will that have severe implications for the family farms and the rural economy of Northern Ireland, it is a major threat to the UK food security.
I suppose people listening to what you've just said might draw the conclusion that some of the bodies you're quoting would say that, wouldn't they? And the government's position is very clear. Let me just quote what Hilary Benn said. There'll be no inheritance tax on the first £1 million. The rate after that will be half the general inheritance tax rate of 40%. The Treasury says it expects only around 500 agricultural estates across the whole of the United Kingdom to be affected next year.
And that statement has been roundly rubbished in the preceding months after that. We in Northern Ireland, we tend to have a smaller sized farm, but a high value land here in Northern Ireland. And we tend to be owner occupiers, and even though some of our farms may be run as partnerships, the collateral tends to be in one name. The main collateral tends to be in one name, and that's what makes us so vulnerable to this tax.
But is that not a contradiction? If you say Northern Ireland's farms tend to be smaller farms, then smaller farms wouldn't be affected by the inheritance tax, because while the £1 million is one figure, in fact, when you take other allowances into account, it can be up to £3 million.
We are so vulnerable because of the high value. We have as high a value for land as there is in the United Kingdom, and the government are very keen to point out there is ways around this. All those mitigations that they say are there, families are not tidy units. They come in all shapes and sizes. All those mitigations come with a risk and come with a cost. And this is what makes our folks so nervous and puts the agricultural industry at risk here.
What do you say are the main challenges then, the main effects that this change will have on farming here and on people generally as consumers, if and when it comes through, as it's currently laid out by the government?
Well, on the consumer piece, this will drive prices up for food on shelves. For the farmers, we are front and centre of a whole environmental debate and wider. There's a lot of demands being made on agriculture from society. And for us to address those demands requires, in a lot of cases, significant investment. And this is a massive disincentivisation for doing long-term investment, because previously family farms thought, well, we'll do this, it'll give the next generation a better chance. Now they're going to be hit with this tax.
We'll talk about those environmental issues a little bit more later in the programme, and we'll hear your thoughts at that stage. I do want to ask you about food security, because that's been raised as a particular concern by the agriculture lobby. I mean, we are not 100% self-sufficient here in Northern Ireland. As I understand it, roughly we import about 40% of our food.
Yeah, we would say 40+% of our food. We will never be 100% self-sufficient, but we think at that level we are vulnerable. We should be, it's hard to put a figure on, but 75% would be a much safer place for the country to be. In this uncertain world, there's wars are rife at the minute. We've just experienced some of the weather events that can happen. And if you're talking to some medical people, they don't rule out a second pandemic at some point. So it's food security. Politicians pay lip service to it, but they don't actually deliver on it for the country. And we've seen when the previous pandemic hit, all of a sudden we were key workers and food security was a big issue.
Let me just ask you finally what you want to see our politicians doing. This is a politics programme. You've already mentioned the Department of Agriculture being sympathetic to your point of view. The difficulty is this is a reserved matter. Our politicians have no say over it. And the UFU, as I understand it, can't get through the door of the Treasury to talk to the people who are actually making the decisions. Where do you go from here, just briefly?
Our local politicians are as one, united on an agreement with our position. And you're right, we are struggling to get into the Chancellor's office. And that we're going to maintain the pressure here. This doesn't come into the spring of 26. So it's continuous and increasing pressure as we go forward. We have to get through that door.
OK, William Irvine, for now, thanks very much indeed. We will come back to you and hear your thoughts a little bit later in the programme, but I want to bring in our agriculture and environment correspondent, Louise Cullen, at this stage. Welcome, Louise. What kind of impact do you think yesterday's protests are likely to have as far as the government listening is concerned?
Well, the government's been emphatic. Rachel Reeves has been very clear. She's not for dialling down on this policy. It did come as a shock to everybody. But when you look at it, it's going to raise around £500 million. And whatever figure you take as the black hole that the government has talked about, whether £9.5 billion or £22 billion, that £500 million is a drop in the ocean. It's very little. And that's the argument that farmers like William are making. And again, Northern Ireland is different to the rest of GB because of that largely owner-occupied farms, where 23,000 of our 26,000 farms are classed as small or very small. But those very high land values will likely put a lot of those farms over that £1 million threshold. Figures out last week suggest that land values in GB could be as little as half what they are here in Northern Ireland. And that revised assessment that DARA provided, that William mentioned as well, that revised things up and extrapolated to say that land could be worth as much when you take in property as £21,000 an acre in 2026 when this policy kicks in.
You will know very well that there will be people watching this programme today who come from an agricultural background who will say, hear to everything that William Irvine has said. But there will be other people as well who will look at this and who will say, look, agricultural land, farms are capital assets. There is a very generous, they might say, series of discounts and mitigations put in place for farmers. Why should farms not be taxed like all other business assets?
Well, that's what farmers argue. These are not easily realised assets. Inheritance tax is a tax on wealth at death, not on a gain. But these are not assets that are easily realised. And also, if you sell a portion of a farm in order to pay a bill, the next generation may be in the position to have to do that, well, then you threaten the viability of the business. And that was why inheritance, the agricultural property relief, was brought in the first place, to underpin and secure that.
OK, just very quickly, if you would, what impact could this change potentially have on the agricultural landscape here in the years ahead if it goes through unchanged?
If it goes through unchanged, what farmers like William are telling us is that it will drive farmers out of business, and that's what farmers themselves are saying as well. I've had farmers in tears talking to me about this, and they fear very much either their own futures are threatened as young farmers or that their children won't be able to inherit.
OK, Louise, for now, thank you very much indeed. Now, coming up in just a moment, we'll hear about the need to reduce carbon emissions and what's being done about it. But first, a look ahead to our Red Lines podcast this week. We're upping our output this year, you'll be glad to hear, hopefully. And this Wednesday, we'll be looking at what the Trump presidency could mean for the Irish economy. I asked the Dublin-based economist David McWilliams for his thoughts.
Trump has to deliver the MAGA set of policies for his people. One of those policies is tariffs, and the other one is the first cousin of tariffs, which is to look at American industry and say, where are you putting your money? And of course, the problem is Ireland sits in the middle. The way I look at it is that Ireland is almost, Mark, like a jockey riding two horses. You have the American horse here, and you have the European horse here. And as long as America and Europe are running together, the jockey's position is just about tenable. But when Europe and America are separating and moving apart, as they are now, the jockey's position becomes very, very difficult. And my sense is that we have had 30 years of almost everything going our way in Ireland. We had free trade, we had no tariffs, we had the free movement of capital, we had a White House that was very pro-Irish. Conor O'Clery wrote a book, I think about 20 years ago, called The Greening of the White House. So we had a huge, as you would say, tailwind, which was very supportive. Trump doesn't have that. His Treasury Secretary doesn't have this. His Commerce Secretary doesn't have this. And what they want to do is they want to bring American jobs, American money, American capital home.
David McWilliams, and that Red Lines conversation will be available from Wednesday on BBC Sounds. Now, when Conor Murphy became the Economy Minister just under a year ago, he appointed a number of what he called critical friends to push his department along on some key priorities. One of those priorities is carbon emissions, and the critical friend in question is Professor David Rooney from Queen's University, and I'm pleased to say he joins me now. Welcome to you, and thank you for joining us today. Broadly speaking, how would you describe the challenge you were given by the Minister?
I mean, the challenge is immense. I mean, if you look at the emissions within Northern Ireland, we are currently sitting at over 21 million tonnes a year. We're obviously dropping that rate at a very slow rate of around 250,000 tonnes a year, so progress is slow. I mean, it's also an extremely complex challenge given how energy and how carbon is effectively are embedded into all aspects of our day-to-day lives. And essentially the changes that then would need to come as we sort of migrate away from fossil fuels, increase the amount of renewables, be able to build out the infrastructure in order to be able to deliver that to people in an affordable way. It's an extremely complex challenge. And again, one that most people probably don't understand in terms of just the size of it.
OK, well, let's see if we can help people to understand it, because it is very complex. As you say, the programme for government is due to be signed off very soon. The draft programme for government includes a climate action plan. It says getting to net zero has to be fair for those businesses that need to change how they operate, and has to be affordable to them and to households. So that's the big debate going on everywhere. How are we doing in terms of achieving that, or beginning to achieve that?
Well, the progress has been happening for a while now. I mean, the big advantages that we've been able to realise include, the renewable energy rollout, which started back in around 2000 and 2006, etc. I mean, that has had an impact, but it has been a small impact. And as I say, as we progress out into the future, we're not making the changes really within the system, which will actually help to deliver the net zero target of 2050.
So what would you consider to be fair or understandable obstacles? What do you think is unjustifiable? I mean, for example, is the lack of available finance an understandable obstacle, or do we have to find a way around that?
Well, the finance is an issue. The cost of being able to deliver net zero, the cost of the transition, heat pumps, electric vehicles, renewable energy deployment, infrastructure changes, water, etc., will be in the tune of billions, tens of billions. Now, it will save the economy billions a year in terms of not having to subsidise or pay for fossil fuels. But when you're talking about billions of pounds of investment, and you're also talking about a government which is currently lacking in the available funds to basically make meaningful change at that type of scale, it does relate then to how are we actually going to help to pay for this transition over the time.
If we want to encourage people to live greener lives, maybe we need to make it easier for them. You mentioned heat pumps. There are people who would say that there should be more subsidies available from government to encourage people to go down that road. If you look at people being encouraged to switch to electric cars, that's going great guns. But the reality is the charging infrastructure to support people with electric cars simply isn't there. So even if people want to try to take these steps, they're not being helped to do that.
Quite correct. And there is a lack of funding available to be able to support initiatives such as EV infrastructure, such as grid connection charging, such as heat pump rollout at the scale that is needed. This is a slow process, and it is one that is going to take significant investment over time in order to be able to realise the changes that are needed in order to be able to hit the targets. We do need to find ways of being able to support people, particularly those vulnerable people, in terms of how they will adapt to the net zero agenda.
Maybe what it needs is greater political will. You've explained in very straightforward, understandable words precisely the scale of the problem that we're facing. But do we have the understanding within our political leaders to make this a policy prioritisation? Because if that doesn't happen, we're going nowhere fast.
Quite correct. I mean, there are a number of things here. One is that this, to me, is more about a race to achieve net zero rather than the actual destination itself. It's who is in the position to be able to deliver products and services, including food products, which are actually in a much more decarbonised way so that we are more attractive to international markets and people want those materials. But we also need joined up policy. When you have little money and you have a big challenge. You need to be very strategic about the interventions you make, and you need things to be joined up. You need to be able to have renewable energy infrastructure, which is then linked into heat infrastructure, which is linked into the agri-food system in order to be able to maximise the value. We really need to be able to have joined up thinking if we're going to make the big wins and the big advantages out of this.
Yeah, it's about politicians understanding the nature of the problem as well. We've got President Trump now withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. His mantra of drill, baby, drill seems to be back on the agenda. How might that attitude affect how countries across the world look at climate targets?
Well, it wasn't a surprise when Trump obviously pulled out of the Paris Agreement. I mean, he had indicated that before and had started that process during his last term. I mean, the key thing now is actually what happens next with that. The intent is to try to increase oil and gas production in order to be able to lower energy prices, but the sector itself is probably less willing to do so because of the potential impact that it would have on their profit lines, as well as being able to reduce the lifetime of their assets. They'll probably try and maintain the status quo as much as possible in order to be able to, because it makes good business sense in that respect. What will happen in the rest of the world? The rest of the world, even at the last time that this happened, continued on that journey in net zero. It knows that oil and gas will eventually run out. It knows it needs to change, and it knows that it needs to be able to do this on behalf of the global issue around climate change. So that direction is set and will probably continue. There will be people who are a bit slower and laggers in that, but again, I think the rest of the world will continue. We want to be a part of that. We want to be able to deliver products and services which actually are better for the environment, better for people, and so on. We
began this programme talking about another challenge for the agriculture sector. Emissions, of course, is an issue that involves farmers, and I just want to broaden the conversation to that area now and bring back William Irvine from the Ulster Farmers Union. We're not going to have time to solve this issue completely on behalf of everybody on the programme today, but broadly speaking, William, where are we in terms of reducing emissions in the agriculture sector?
The agriculture industry is fully focused on the direction of travel to reduce emissions. The new support schemes post-Brexit are designed to encourage us to reduce emissions. There's a journey to travel here. It is a challenge to farmers because it's a change to their way of doing things, but we are on that journey and we have a role to play here.
Do you think farmers are sympathetic to what needs to be done? Do they understand the significance and the importance of it?
Yeah, quite a few of us do. But as I say, I don't think any section of society likes change. It brings about uncertainty. And ultimately, farms are small businesses. And there needs to be some certainty. Can we make this pay for us? Are we going to be a viable business if we do this?
OK, let's just get a final thought from Professor David Rooney. The two of you were in a deep discussion about this before the programme. I wonder where you think the farming sector is in terms of grappling with the scale of this challenge.
Well, as William says, I mean, there's a number of farmers who do embrace this issue around climate and have taken measures to reduce their emissions overall. I mean, our analysis of the situation says that the agricultural sector in Northern Ireland has probably the greatest role to play in the decarbonisation of Northern Ireland. I mean, you mentioned Trump. If we were to go back to another president, JFK, I mean, I could paraphrase that and sort of, we asked that question about not necessarily how we decarbonise agriculture, but how agriculture and agri-tech could help to decarbonise the entire economy. And we believe very, very strongly that by integrating in across renewable energy, across agri-tech, across construction, etc., we do have that ability to work with that sector to actually change and put us on a path to net zero.
It's a very complicated subject. We're dealing with two quite complex subjects today, and this subject in particular is one I think that can lead some people simply to glaze over because they can't get a foothold. They can't even begin to understand what people are talking about and the scale of what needs to be done, never mind how it can actually be delivered. How do you make it relevant to people who want to engage with it but find that very difficult?
It is. It's just to communicate out the kind of the overall scale of the issue is a problem. I mean, Northern Ireland uses around 1 billion units of energy a week. You know, the total amount of renewable energy that we have in Northern Ireland wouldn't last you a month. You know, the agri-food sector through things like biogas could probably give you around 2 months worth of energy supply. There is ways that we can start to connect up parts of this puzzle to be able to communicate that out in language that people will understand and to see the opportunity ahead.
Okay, really interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you both very much indeed. Just time for a final word with Louise Cullen. What some people might take out of that and what might frighten the politicians is David Rooney saying we need to invest to save, and that is at a time when there is huge pressure on every single budget up at Stormont.
Well, that's true, and we've heard this call for investment. We know that we need to increase our grid. We know that we need to increase the skills in order to be able to deliver that, and there's a social dimension communicating that as well. But there's a legislative dimension. We have a target of generating 80% renewable energy by 2030. We also have targets for reducing our emissions that are built in to our climate change legislation. Now, in terms of that renewable target, here's a sobering thought. Today, 2030 is 1,801 days away. That's an 80% target and a 48% reduction in emissions. That reduction in emissions is currently sitting at just over 26% since 1990. We've got 5 years to make this work. That, in the eyes of people like David, should focus the minds of our politicians. But if the money's not there, what can they do?
Yeah, and again, just to bring it back to the basics, like heat pumps and electric vehicles, people will say, I am well disposed to the idea of that, but I need more help to actually go out and buy a heat pump for my house or buy an electric car, because the network isn't there to allow me to actually move around because there aren't enough charging stations. And the infrastructure simply currently does not exist and probably won't exist in 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. And if you dive into getting a heat pump, well, there's not much point doing that unless you've retrofitted your house and increased your insulation and done all of that work, which also takes money, which is why Stormont is consulting on support for renewable energy and for non-domestic renewable supports as well. But this is a long road that we are on. Time is running out.
And we've got the same minister responsible for agriculture and environment, two key policy areas. Sometimes they are uncomfortable bedfellows, aren't they?
But they do keep each other honest as well. And as both David and William have made clear, agriculture has an opportunity in many ways to move from being seen as the villain of the piece to potentially being the hero through things like biomethane. You could create small heat networks, and Northern Ireland lends itself in its geography very well to that. But again, we're back to the big question, who pays for it and how much will it be?
OK. Issues that we will return to on this programme and elsewhere on our airwaves, I would have thought, in the months and years ahead. Louise, thanks very much indeed. We've got to leave it there. That's it for now. There are still a lot of people feeling the effects of the storm damage, and continuing coverage of the repair and clean-up operations will, of course, feature heavily across our digital, TV and radio coverage today and over the next few days. I'll be back with Redlines this Wednesday and The View, of course, on Thursday. But until then, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.